Welcome to Designing an Effective PowerPoint Presentation, part of the Sharp Healthcare CME Tips series. Today I hope to provide you a series of basic guidelines to help faculty for either CME activities or CP activities present their ideas effectively using PowerPoint or other related software programs, making sure to enhance your delivery and not to eclipse it, and also to enhance the experience for the audience, as they should be the focus as you design your presentation. And just a gentle reminder that as you design your presentation, it shouldn't be your script. Your script should be your notes, and the presentation should intend to highlight key points you make throughout that you want your audience to walk away with. That is capsulated best by Gar Reynolds, who happens to be a best-selling author and speaker, and if you search him on the internet, you'll find that he has TED Talks specifically related to how to use PowerPoint and how to give an effective presentation. Gar says, "The slides themselves were never meant to be the star of the show. The star, of course, is your audience. People came to hear you and to be moved or informed, or both, by you and your message. Don't let your message and your ability to tell a story get derailed by slides that are unnecessarily complicated, busy, or full of what Edward Tufte calls chart junk." So keep this quote in mind as we go through today's tips. We'll be looking at the top 10 tips for PowerPoint design. And this is taken, as far as the tips themselves, the headers, from Gar's information available on his website related to PowerPoint presentations. Some of the additional information you'll see and other sources and images were brought in from other resources related to PowerPoint. But we will go through each of these in detail. How to keep it simple, how to limit your bullet points and text, how to keep animation to the minimum, the importance of using high quality graphics, having a theme but maybe not a template, which charts to use when, and how to use those new cool things called infographics, the role of color and how to use it to improve the experience for your audience and make sure that it's readable. And readability also is impacted by the fonts you choose. And ultimately, tips on how to use video and audio in moderation, when it's appropriate and maybe when it's not. And ultimately, how to use the slide sorter in PowerPoint. This will help make sure that your presentation is in the order that will make it most effective, and that you have the slides you need, but not too many. First, tip 1, keeping it simple. This covers a lot of things, and you'll hear me reiterate this throughout the presentation today. First off, you want to keep your slides simple. You'll notice here there's two different slides. One is primarily an image here on the right, and one is primarily text on the left. But they both make a very clear point, and there's not a lot on the slide, and it leaves a lot of room for you as the presenter to add detail and depth to what you see here on these slides. These are effective, simple, highlighting key point slides. Continuing with keep it simple, you want to make sure you have plenty of white space or negative space. The slide here on the right explains the difference between negative space and positive space. All right? Negative space is the space around your words and your images, and the space between words and images when you have things together. You want to make sure that you don't put so much information on your slide that you don't have any white space or negative space. Negative space is important, and it improves readability as well as helping the audience understand what you're trying to emphasize. These are two examples of appropriate use of negative space. Next, keeping it simple, know your boundaries. If you know that you're not building your content for people to look at on a computer because maybe you're building some online educational materials, and you know that you're going to be in a large ballroom somewhere in a hotel or in an auditorium, and your content is going to be projected onto a screen or a large TV, you're going to make sure that you want to know your boundaries of where your content should be. And this slide is an example of what many AV companies use when they're lining up their projectors on their screens prior to you putting your presentation on there with the content. And if you want to make sure that your content shows up on the screen and all of a sudden when you're presenting, the edges of your presentation are gone because you lose that on the edge of the screen as you drape around the screen, then you're going to want to keep everything in from the 5% of the screen around the outside, maybe even the inside 10%. All right, so you see lines here for 85% as your title safe area, and 90 and 95% safe as your action safe area, right? And you can see the different fonts here and what they look like at different sizes and even different colors and grayscales. The point of this slide mainly is don't put stuff on your slide all the way out to the edges. There's a good chance that it won't show up on the screen when it gets projected. Tip 2, limiting bullet points and texts. One way to do that is to think about the concept of one slide, one idea. You see two different examples here, one using an infographic on the left and one using an image with some text on the right. And it's very obvious in each of these slides what the key point of the slide is and what the presenter is going to expand on. If you're getting into a situation where you're putting a lot of information on a slide and it has several bullet points, you may want to reconsider, as each of those bullet points may be an indication that you need a new slide. And just because you make a slide doesn't mean you need to spend forever on it. You can come, quickly show something, and then move on to the next thing. Doing so keeps your audience focused in the moment and not reading the bullet points and reading ahead and not listening to what you're saying right now, but waiting for something that you're going to say later. Another way to limit bullet points in text is to consider the guideline of a max of 4 to 6 bullets. Right? And you can see a good example of that here on the left, where it's a brief agenda slide of something probably that's going to happen in a meeting or kind of what's going to get covered. And you'll notice there are 5 bullet points. Each bullet point is no more than 3 words. It gets the point across. So if you are going to put text on a slide, this is something that I would consider a good slide. It gets the key points across, it allows you to talk about what you need to talk about, and it doesn't distract the audience and push them forward and keep them from listening to you. The slide on the right, however, I would argue would be difficult for anyone in the audience to read or see, and I would be curious to know the presenter of the slide and would be wondering if they're using that slide as a script slide. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's something that we're trying to avoid. If you want to look at an example in this slide, it says green buildings and green products. I would argue that green buildings should be one slide, green products should be another slide. And much of what's under the second level bullet point shouldn't be there. Those should be things that you should be saying to me. So we've got a slide here that probably is at least 2 slides, maybe more. So if you have a habit of building slides like this, you'll notice it's not really easy to read. There's too much information there, and it's actually going to distract your audience from listening to you, the expert. You're going to want to avoid this. Another thought when you're looking at limiting bullet point and texts. If you're guilty of either of these slides, you're also going to maybe want to take a look at how you can improve and put less text on a slide. The slide on the left here is basically a paragraph. This is something I would expect to read in a newspaper, an article, or on a website and a blog. This is very difficult for the audience, and I have a fear that maybe even the presenter is turning around and reading the slide to me as an audience member, which is not exactly the experience I want to have. So if you're building slides like this, again, there are probably several slides here in all of this content, and you want to pull out what you're trying to highlight. Now the slide on the right is a little better. It's a little bit more organized. There's more negative space, right? And technically there's only 6 bullets here. So according to the last thing I told you, you'd think, well, this is a great slide, right? But look how small the text is. And we'll talk about that later, but it's not really easy to read. And I would argue, if we're going with the one slide, one idea concept, that this may be 6 slides or maybe 4 slides. That if you really want to emphasize what you're talking about when you're talking about, quote, the sales paradigm shift, that you're going to need more slides to emphasize this. These are very heavy text slides, examples of what not to do. Tip 2, again, continuing with the limit bullet points and text, create a handout. All right? If I can take your presentation and read it and get everything I need from the presentation, then why do I need you as the presenter or the content expert to stand at the podium and tell me why it's important if you've put it all on your slides? If what you're doing is complex or you want to make sure that the audience has something to walk away with, don't worry about designing your slides so that they can walk away with your slides with everything they need. Take the highlights from your slide and create a separate handout. The cool thing about the CME portal at Sharp is if you create this handout, we can put it up as part of the syllabus and people can have access to that. So maybe it's a little bit extra work to create the handout, but it's a better experience for the audience and it's a better experience for you, because you put yourself at front and center as the expert, presenting on the content, engaging the audience with you, instead of the audience trying to understand and read perhaps overly wordy slides. Tip 3, limiting animation. Animation can be fun, can create a change of pace, it can create a point of interest, but it's overused or abused, whether it's slide transitions or things moving on the screen, then it becomes cumbersome and it becomes distracting. So like anything, you have to find the balance and the happy medium. The first slide I have here is an example of perhaps too much animation. If I were presenting the slide to you as the content expert, animations and transitions should be used minimally. I've already said that. Particularly, what should happen is that we don't want to use transitions or animations on every slide. Additionally, you want to make sure they have a specific purpose, and you want to make sure that they're used in the same way throughout the presentation for consistency and minimizing distraction. Now you may say that's not too bad. I highlighted each sentence as I was talking about it to get you to focus on it, and I didn't let you get distracted by some additional details on the first point by bringing it in later. But as you'll know, now I'm adding images to the slide, talking about PowerPoint, talking about Google Slides, and talking about Prezi. I would argue that perhaps this is a little too much. A better example may be this, where I've already got my image on my slide. So we know we're talking about things that you may use in PowerPoint. Maybe it's Google Slides, maybe it's Prezi. Most common is PowerPoint. So as a presenter, I'm going to go with the majority and I'm going to focus on that. And now I'm going to bring my points in one at a time as I talk about them as a group, saying that animations and transitions should be used minimally, that they should have a specific purpose, and that they should be used consistently throughout the presentation in the same way so that you minimize distraction. A little bit cleaner, a little bit quicker, and even my verbal presentation of the content is better because my animations are better. Tip 4, using high quality graphics. How many of you have sat in on a presentation and seen a graph or a picture and gone, I don't even know what that says or why it's important? You don't want to be that expert or that presenter. The first way to avoid being that presenter is to make sure that you're using high quality graphics. You don't need to know what DPI means, but you need to know that a high-res image is at least 300 DPI, and those are the images you should try to be using in your presentation. Specifically because if you find it in a smaller size and you want to blow it up on the slide, as in this example here, and you still want it to look good when it's up on the screen, then it's going to hold up and it's not going to look pixelated like the image on the right. If you pick an image that's a lower resolution and it's smaller and you try to make it bigger, it gets pixelated. So if you really want to use that image and you can't find a high-res image, you need to find a bigger size of that lower res image. Because the minute you take an image and try to make it bigger, right, it's going to stretch it out. And if it doesn't have the pixel count, to be effective, you're going to get more of what looks like on the right than you are on the left. And if there are words and numbers and such in the image that you're using, it's going to be impossible, if not difficult, for your audience to read. Additionally, we all know what clip art looks like. Maybe it's funny, maybe you use it here and there for a laugh, but really you should stay away from it. Use photographs. There's plenty of sites out there with free professional images, or just credit the image if you happen to use something that you're worried might be copyrighted. Additionally, using icons. Icons is kind of the wave of the now. I mean, how many times have you seen a handout, a brochure, or something on a website, and instead of it having a bullet point, it has a circle or an image next to it that instantly tells you what it's about, or what you're about to say, or what's coming up. CME is even trying to incorporate more of these into their instructions and some of the stuff that they're doing. There are plenty of websites out there that have free icons. Some of them are listed here on the left. Tip 5. Having a visual theme, but maybe avoiding a template. Now you'll notice I'm using a slide template here because Sharp has said, we have a template, we'd like you to use it. Keeping in mind that the Sharp template now is in a 16:9 ratio, not the 4:3 ratio. So if you need to know how to change the ratio setting on your presentation, please reach out and let us know. We'll be happy to set it up for you, as Sharp CME is asking all faculty to have their presentations built in 16:9. And a lot of times what happens is if you just simply transition from one look to another, your content gets moved around and the design doesn't look the way you've intended. Here are some examples of visual themes, people being consistent, but these are not themes if you go into the design your theme section of the PowerPoint that you're going to find. Everybody's seen those templates, everybody's used those templates, and sometimes they're appropriate, and sometimes you can tweak the master slide a little bit and it will do what you need. But if you have the time or the inclination, or you know someone who can, and you want to come up with a theme for yourself that speaks to you and what you do, then it would be worth the time and effort. And you'll notice there's consistency in images, text, infographic size, and here's 3 different examples, different approaches. Tip 6, using appropriate charts and or infographics. Now, especially in medicine, we have charts everywhere. But most often, I think what happens is presenters take those and they open the PDF version of whatever randomized control trial they want to present about, and they take the little cutting tool and they cut out an image and they paste it on a slide. Well, now you've got a picture and not a chart from, say, Excel or something, and you expand that and maybe it gets pixelated and you can't read it. If that's the case, I would encourage you, a lot of times now, those trials, when you open them up, you can click on a link and get the specific high-res image file. You want to make sure to do that. But if you've done your own research or you've got your own data and you've built your own slides, right, in Excel with charts or whatnot, you want to make sure you choose the right chart for the right type of data. One, generally, you want to make sure that there aren't tons and tons of groups that you're showing in the data. You'll notice here in the pie chart, there's only 3 chunks of information. I would say keep it 3 to 5. And this is great for a situation where you've asked people to answer a question and they can pick from 3 or 4 responses. And you'll notice here this example is about communication. How do you like to communicate? Verbally, visually, vocally, right? Audibly listening. It's very simple. The pie chart helps you understand what percentage of 100 is happening. You've also got a couple of different types of bar charts. You have your vertical bar chart, which is great for comparing groups A to B, and the recommendation is not to have any more than maybe 8 bars on the graph. And you'll see here there's 4 years, there's comparative data for each of those 4 years. It would be large enough that it would be easy to read. If you're doing things out over 10 years, 12 years, then you may want to look at a different format. It would may be really hard to read the different bar charts as the bars get skinnier and skinnier. And on the right here, we have the horizontal bar chart. And what you've noticed is you're comparing the same amount of money for different regions. All right. So depending on what your independent variable is and what your dependent variable is, you're going to want to try and make sense of what the best graph type is. And obviously line graphs are great for when you're looking at over time or you're trying to predict the future, as you can see here on the bottom left. And in rare occasion, there may even be situations where a chart is more appropriate than a graph. It may allow you to appropriately highlight something that you're trying to say relative to maybe sensitivity of a test or specificity of a test or number of treatments needed to harm, etc., etc., things that are common when we're looking particularly at medical research. If charts aren't your thing and you want a different way to present your data, for example, that slide I showed you earlier with the employees with the 35% with the hourglass, then you may be somebody who wants to use an infographic. There are some free websites out there that can help you build infographics and make them individualized, like you see here on the left. They're talking about sharks, so you see a lot of images of sharks and boats and how they represent their data. And keep in mind, these are examples of, this is something that would be a poster size or an 8x11 size that I would print out on a piece of paper. So if you're doing this sort of thing on a slide, you probably aren't going to have more than 1 or 2 infographics on a one slide, thinking about that one idea, one slide kind of concept. So for example, on the right here, where it's talking about the benefits of using infographics online, you see the brain image here, and it says 90% of information transmitted to the brain is visual. That could be one slide, and you can talk about that slide in whatever other ways you want, but you highlight that particular statistic. Or you can talk about an estimated 32% of open ocean sharks are threatened with extinction. And what you see here is the number of sharks relative to 100. All right, that could be one image that you put on a slide. So if you're so inclined or you're interested and you're not quite sure where you can go to build these types of infographics, reach out to us. We can help you with that. Tip 7, properly using color. And I would argue that aside from using proper spacing, minimizing text, and really using the slides to emphasize your presentation and not be a crutch and your notes for your presentation, making good color choices is probably one of the biggest challenges I see for most presenters that I've worked with. In order to use color properly, you need to understand the color wheel and what the relationship is between various colors and how that impacts readability and visual pleasure as far as being pleasing to the eye and making it easy for the brain to pick up on what's going on the slide. You'll see that this particular graphic is linked below, so if you want more information you can go to that particular website. But I like this particular graphic because, one, it gives you hex codes for common colors that people use. That's the hashtag or pound sign and the number and letter combinations that you see in each of the pie slices. But it also gives you definitions of analogous, complementary, triadic, and split complement colors. And knowing these definitions will help you make good color choices when you're coming up with your theme, when you're deciding what color your background should be and what color your text should be. All right. There's also monochromatic options, but I would argue that's a little bit harder to use. You want contrast when you're designing your presentation, especially when it's going to be projected on a screen. So using monochromatic colors is probably not going to be ideal. Using things like analogous colors and complementary colors and triadic colors are more likely when you're making background color choices and font color choices. And you'll notice here at the bottom left too that different colors have different meanings and evoke different emotions. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide, but remember the colors you choose may also invoke a certain impression. Again, looking at color with readability and background relative to the text. You may or may not think of this very often unless you yourself happen to be colorblind. But if someone is red-green colorblind and you use some of the color combinations on the left in your slides, what you'll notice is on the right for the colorblind person, they may not actually be able to read your slide except in very few cases. you'll notice that they can read the slide with the 25 in it, and they can read the slide with the 56 in it. But if you use red and green background to text, it may look something more like the slides where you can't really read numbers or colors, or it just looks like dots. So keep in mind that red and green probably aren't great combinations, and yellow-blue aren't great combinations, as those are the two most common versions of color blindness. Proper using color, I've hinted about background versus text throughout, but now we're going to talk about it specifically. And the key is contrast. So when you're looking at building your presentation, one, you want to know whether or not you're going to be doing it on the computer and it's going to be online, or if you're going to be in that big ballroom. And you may want to have an idea of how well lit that ballroom is. If it's a darker ballroom, then it may be better for you to use a darker background with a lighter text. However, noting that after about 20 feet, that gets harder and harder to read. If you're in a light room, a well-lit room in a big room, then you're going to want to go with a light background, not necessarily white, and a darker text. And most of the situations that we're in relative to Sharp, that's what I would actually recommend. If you're presenting to a large group using a screen, I would recommend a light background with a dark text. Depending on how bright the room is, if it's going to be a little bit darker, then you could go with white and black, or white and some other darker color. Here's some examples of some things that work quite well. All right, you'll notice the white backgrounds with the contrasting text, or the dark backgrounds and white and light colored text seem to work best. If you're presenting in a larger room, I would actually avoid some of the options you see here in the middle with the blue and the yellow, or the yellow background with the different colors. Yellow and blue again because of color blindness issues. But yellow also because if it's projected on a big screen, it may be so bright, it may be hard for individuals to read the screen, even though the contrast is good, like in the example with the black text. The other thing that you may need to consider is that you're building your presentation on a laptop or a computer, and it may look good for you. So for example, on the left, it may look good that you have a dark slide with red text or blue text. But you've got to remember the impact of the projector and making that bigger on a bigger screen. And if you take the slide on the left and you project it onto a screen, you get the image on the right. And you'll notice that the contrast is much more unclear. It's poorer, and it's much harder to read. So keep in mind, just because it looks good on your computer or your laptop doesn't mean that it's going to look good on that 10 by 12 or 9 by 16 screen that it's going to be projected onto in that hotel ballroom, or in the Nellie Barrington room, or any of the rooms that we have here on the Sharp campuses. So that's a situation. If you're going to use this dark background, I would actually argue that maybe you want to use white as your text. The title looks much better. Or you go with that white background and you use a darker text, and you're much more likely to be successful. Again, here is me highlighting using the use of color and provoking emotion. All right, here's some other examples of the emotions and the feelings and the senses that you get when you use different colors. There's no right or wrong on what color you use when. Just keep in mind that your choices may cause a somewhat visceral response to your content based on the colors you use, and not necessarily what you're saying. Tip 8. Choosing fonts carefully. This again comes down to readability. And so the first thing that we're going to want to look at is choosing the right font type. If you're not doing typeset and you're not printing a newspaper or publishing a book, then you want to make sure that you're using sans serif fonts. A sans serif font is the example that you see here on the right, where there are no tails on the font. You'll notice the A on the left has tails at the bottom, whereas the A on the right does not. So when you're building a PowerPoint presentation, you want to make sure that you're using a font that's a sans serif font. And you may say, well, what are some common sans serif fonts? What you'll see here is I've provided examples of both. On the left are common serif fonts. Times New Roman probably being one of the most common. How many of you wrote papers in high school, college, graduate school using Times New Roman? It's great for a paper. Not so great for slides. But you'll notice the options on the right are all sans serif fonts. None of them have tails, and they all would work effectively for a PowerPoint presentation. This module itself is actually using Arial, which is the item listed at the top. Again, looking at fonts and readability, you want to make sure that you're using the right size. You probably could change these sizes plus or minus 2 points, but I wouldn't change them much more than that, because you have to remember that the person that's in that ballroom sitting all the way in the back needs to be able to read as well as the person that's sitting right next to the projector in front of the room and can see you smile as you present. The recommended sizes are 40 point for titles, 32 point for subtitles or bullets, and then 24 point for contents. Anything smaller than that, then it probably shouldn't be on the slide, or in its indication maybe that you're putting too much text and too much information on one slide and you need a second and or third slide to be able to make those things larger and emphasize the points that you need. Tip 9. Using video and audio in moderation. We all love video, we all love audio, right? So when we're using video, what's it great for? It's great for showing those concrete examples of things that maybe we can't explain so well in words. All right? It also encourages the audience to kind of actively process the situation instead of maybe sitting there and passively listening to you. It's a great change of pace, shakes things up a little bit to make sure that you're still maintaining engagement with your audience. All right? The final tip is you don't want every slide in your presentation to be a video, right? Everything in moderation, just like coffee and tea and chocolate and pizza. But finally, to get a more professional presentation, you want to make sure that you embed those videos in your presentation. You don't want to have to close your PowerPoint presentation, click on a link that you've saved on the taskbar of your computer, and then have it open. You simply want to click on the video in the slide and have it play. Again, from a functional perspective on how to use PowerPoint, if you need help with this, reach out to us and we're glad to help. Now for the audio. Again, use it in moderation. It should only be used for emphasis. Maybe you've actually done an interview with someone, or you've listened to a podcast and you've gotten permission and you have some content in that podcast or with that interview that you want to share with the audience, and you don't just want to read it. Go ahead, put that audio clip in there. The only thing that you shouldn't do is that if you have a lot of motion going on in your slides or you have some animations, watch out for those cheesy dings and bell rings and that sort of thing. It doesn't really add to your presentation and it just makes it more complicated for you. And finally, just like your videos, you're going to want to make sure the audio is actually embedded into your presentation for a smooth professional look. Finally, and last but not least, tip 10, spending time in the slide sorter. For those of you that may have never visited the slide sorter, it's going to be under the View tab in your PowerPoint. And then you're going to notice the various views. The slide sorter view is the third view from the left. And once you click on slide sorter, you'll see something that looks like the image here below the taskbar for PowerPoint. And you'll notice it's actually this particular module that I'm going over with you now, but it's my first several slides in order. What it does is it allows me to see the big picture. It allows me to see everything that I have going on. Do I have all the slides I need? Do I have too many? Maybe I have too many slides on one particular point, and maybe I don't really need 3 slides. Maybe I only need 1. Or maybe I realize that I'm not talking about things in the order that's most effective for the presentation. This allows me to move things around easily without having to go back and forth and cut and paste and do all of that sort of stuff. So if you've not become familiar with the slide sorter, I highly recommend that you do so. In summary of all the things that we've covered today, the biggest thing that you need to remember is that you want your PowerPoint presentation to augment your live presentation. It should support the audience experience. It shouldn't support your need for notes and a script. Those should be generated separately for you to use while you're on the podium. Keep it simple. And that follows for how much you use audio and video, your design, your theme, and how you focus on one point on one slide, and ultimately to how you present your content. At the end of the day, you want to make sure that your slides are readable. So not only does that relate to layout, but it relates to font choices and color choices. and also making sure that you're using high-res images, and that your images and your animation and your video and or audio emphasize your key points. And finally, we want to avoid excessive use of text and bullets. It goes back to keeping things clean and simple and easy to read and emphasizing those key points. If you'd like additional information, here are the link to 4 of the resources that I use to build this module and presentation content. There are many, many others out there. Just like there are websites out there that will help you build infographics, that will help you find icons, that can help you make color choices. You name it, there's probably a website out there for it. So I appreciate your time today. Thank you for listening. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the CME department. Thank you.